Well, the Nazis were involved in a number of very arcane black projects. There have been persistent rumors ever since the war, actually, that they were building some sort of saucer-like aircraft. And these technologies range the whole gamut. If you look at the stories that are out there, from vectored jet exhaust aircraft to the idea that they would create a saucer where the whole turbine was basically the saucer itself, a gigantic fan, a gigantic turbine. And you can actually find online some movies, apparently wartime. I'm rather suspicious of them, but apparently from wartime of Nazi officers wheeling one of these large suction saucers, as I call them, into a hangar. This was actually aired on Russian television recently, a couple of years ago, on a program in Russia called Stranoye Dielo that they interviewed me on. And when they sent me the clip of the show, I saw this film that they had found somewhere. I suspect that it originates from a post-war neo-Nazi group that has put out a number of videos, but those designs are there, and I've covered some of them in my books. One in particular was a patent for such a saucer that was granted to a German by the name of Fleissner that had apparently worked on some of these types of aerodynes at Peenemünde, the rocket facility there. But there are also stories that they were involved in much more exotic advanced technologies, like the Nazi Bell, of course, which I've covered in a number of books. They had an interesting thing that I think is very important for people to realize how it may have influenced post-war American developments. They set up a staff under an SS general by the name of Hans Kammler. This was called the Kammler Stab, as a matter of fact, the Kammler staff. And Kammler did a very interesting thing. When he set this, basically it was a secret weapons think tank, for want of a better expression. He set up this staff that he originated by saying, first of all, that any scientists, technicians working for this are freed from Nazi Party ideology. They were free to investigate any line of physics, any line of technology, including, the banned so-called Jewish physics and aspects of quantum mechanics and so on that were anathema to official Nazi Party ideology. So Kammler, in effect, set up a think tank that was designed to have these scientists brainstorm their way to second, third, and fourth generation weapons systems, and to doke out the aspects of the technology tree that they needed to achieve certain mileposts or bellwethers on this march to technological progress. In effect, what Kammler did was he set up a version of DARPA in Nazi Germany, a Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And basically, this was highly classified, and Kammler, being in the position that he was, had access, of course, to all the slave labor in the Nazi concentration camp. So he was in charge of just this enormous, secretive black projects agency with an enormous labor pool to develop some of these projects. And I've always kind of thought that this outfit was really responsible for the explosion of technology that we see happen in that short 12 years that the Third Reich is in existence. It's just an incredible story. With the Kammler Stab, you have really the creation, for the first time in history, of where a great power takes a significant portion of its capital, and I mean by that more than just financial capital. I mean the human creativity and imagination, and parks all of the best talent that they can into essentially a secretive organization, which begins such a vast technological expansion so quickly that, to a certain extent, I think you're seeing the historical origins of what Mr. Dolan calls a breakaway civilization. His idea is if you have enough money over time investigating advanced scientific and technological concepts and actually engineering them into existence, that you might end up with a group on planet Earth that is so vastly far ahead of the rest of humanity in terms of what it knows publicly, that in effect becomes a breakaway civilization. It has its own technology, it has its own thoughts, even its own cosmology, and so on and so forth. And I think he's absolutely right there, because I think there's certainly evidence to this effect within the American Black Projects community. Recently, Russia has shown us quite a few things, revealed that they have some capabilities that we didn't expect that they had. So I think that we are dealing with the potential that there's a group of people on this planet with access to some very exotic technologies, and that have, for want of a better expression, have a different culture. It's a different civilization. It's a different way of thinking. When we look at the vast amount of money that has been revealed over the past, say, 15 years since the administration of Bush II, when we look at the vast amount of money that has been publicly admitted that they cannot account for, most of it coming out of the Pentagon, of course, we're dealing here, I think, with the possibility that, number one, that money can buy an awful lot of underground hidden installations. But there's another story, as you know, that has come out in recent weeks, and this is all the very strange goings-on in Antarctica. I mean, my word, we've had Patriarch Kirill III, the Patriarch of Moscow, go to Antarctica. The story was he went down there to bless, the Orthodox chapel for the Russians there. Well, any bishop can do this, It's sending the Patriarch is like sending the Pope, to Antarctica. And then that was followed up by the visit of John Kerry, the Secretary of State, and Buzz Aldrin. Yeah. Well, this is exactly my thinking. Something obviously is going on in Antarctica. I mean, with Kirill III and Secretary Kerry and Buzz Aldrin going down there within a matter of weeks of each other. Clearly something is going on down there. And, the way I look at it is if you're going to have a Black Projects world, the perfect place to park some of that stuff is going to be in Antarctica, because access to that continent is very limited. It's very restricted. The nations that have a presence there guard whatever it is they're doing there very, very closely. We've seen all sorts of stories about Antarctica. I blogged about one recently where Lockheed Martin was revealed to have a presence there when one of their employees down there was medically evacuated. And of course we never heard any more about that story. But for me the story was Lockheed Martin being there at all, because of course they're a major defense contractor. So that indicates to me that the possibility is there that something of a technological defense-related nature is going on that continent. So, yeah, I think if we're looking at a breakaway civilization and where they're going to park all of this stuff, we have to look to underground installations, and we have to look to remote regions of the world, inaccessible regions of the world, like Antarctica. I think, there's been the persistent stories. I'm not a believer in these stories that, the Nazis established some sort of research UFO-related base there. I've never believed that story per se. But the possibility, we keep getting hints that something of a technological nature is going on down there, because the Russians, of course, were very secretive about whatever it was that they had discovered at their Lake Vostok facilities, where they've been investigating that underground, under-ice lake for several years. We now have all of these events concerning Antarctica. So it appears that, with the presence of Lockheed Martin in addition to this, that something technological is down there. Maybe they found some very ancient human technology. The Nazi expedition in 38 and 39, as I've written in my books, was sponsored by Rudolf Hess and Hermann Goering. Well, Hess had, as most people know, Hess had a very, very strong interest in the occult and in esoteric subjects. And there's always the idea of, Atlantis, the continent that was submerged underwater. Well, Antarctica fits the bill perfectly because it's a continent literally submerged underwater with all the ice there. And the other problem here is, Hermann Goering, of all people to be involved sponsoring an expedition like that. Well, this is not a gentleman who has any sort of interest in Atlantis or things like this, but he certainly has an interest in power and technologies and things of this nature. So it could either be that they have found remains or technological artifacts of some very ancient civilization down there, or possibly found evidence of an extraterrestrial technology or something that originated off planet in some form or fashion. We had the Clinton White House, if you recall, back in the 1990s, making that statement publicly about the recovery of a meteor in Antarctica that had come from Mars that apparently contained fossilized microbial life. So there's just all sorts of high strangeness going on with that continent, and I am very serious about the possibility that whatever it is that's going on down there, it may have a technological nature, and it may be that they have found trace evidence of some sort of a lost ancient technology, of something that may have originated off planet of a technological nature. We simply don't know, but they're keeping a tight lid on whatever it is. For the Secretary of State to go on a trip around the world, essentially a diplomatic junket, as it were, and then take time during that schedule to go down to Antarctica. Well, the chief diplomat, we were told the story that Kerry was interested in climate change data down there. Well, he can read climate change data from Antarctica in the warm, cozy offices at Foggy Bottom. He doesn't need to go down there. So, the way it looks, an 86-year-old Apollo astronaut. Well, there's something else about Buzz Aldrin's visit down there that I thought was extremely interesting, and I pointed this out again in one of my blogs about that story. Is not only is he showing some sort of medical signs of stress, as far as I know, Mr. Aldrin was not in bad health. Otherwise, they would not have let him go down there. And before he left, very interestingly, he posted a comment on his Twitter account that, we're counting down for our trip to the launch pad. And I thought, well, gee, there's two ways of taking that. Either he's just using familiar astronaut language, and kind of a bit of rhetorical play, or else he's letting out code, that there's something going down there on Antarctica, and Antarctica is functioning essentially as a launch pad. And again, perfect place to have secretive space launches of some sort, and with the presence of Lockheed Martin down there, you've got to wonder. So there's, he's a 33rd degree Mason. He did that little Masonic ritual up on the moon when he and Neil Armstrong landed there. So there's all sorts of stuff going on here to indicate that there's more going on in Antarctica than meets the eye. So high strangeness indeed. And, I entertain that possibility as well because, if there is such an interface or interaction with somebody from off-planet, with extraterrestrials or subterrestrials or whatever, if there is some sort of interaction with some species that's not necessarily Homo sapiens sapiens, then the perfect person to send down there to interact would be people like Kirill III or Secretary Kerry. Well, Russia, as I've said many occasions, Whitley, Russia is really the first phenomenon of what I'm calling a post-postmodern state. They're engaged in a national experiment, in a certain sense, to revitalize their cultural, civilizational roots within Orthodox Christianity. You see Putin displaying prominently, on many occasions, displaying the symbols of the Tsarist regime. The Romanov eagle. There's movements in Russia to bring the Romanov family back to Russia. They've held services of national repentance for murdering the Tsar and his family in the Kremlin and in the churches inside the Kremlin. It's a very, very bizarre thing that we're seeing in Russia. I think most Western commentators just really don't understand what they're looking at. They think of Putin as sort of a neo-Stalinist revival, of which he's not. But as part of this revival, I think we're seeing increasingly indications that Russia is going to play the soft power card. We've already seen Kirill III write opinion pieces on Russia Today, analyzing the decay of Western culture and for him the religious reasons behind it. So Kirill, as the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, is a representative, so to speak, of that tradition. So any contact with putative extraterrestrials or some other group that may be down there interfacing with humanity, someone like Kirill representing a religious influence or a religious perspective would be vital. It would be the Russian Orthodox equivalent of sending the Pope down there. Well, the other thing we need to remember about Kirill's trip down there was that he had just come from that historic meeting with Pope Francis I, where the two of them signed this joint declaration in Havana, mostly concerned with the persecution of Christians in the Islamic world. So, in other words, he goes directly from his meeting with Pope Francis, which was another historic first. That's the first time that a Roman Pope and an Orthodox Patriarch from Moscow have met personally and then gone on to issue a joint declaration. Well, he went directly from that meeting down to Antarctica. So I'm thinking, just looking at all the context, that everything is pointing to something major going on down there. And it would not surprise me at all that that meeting in Havana had probably some quiet conversation between the two of them prior to his visit going down there, because as you say, if the Pope went down there, it would be just a major media event. There's so much change taking place. It's interesting to me to contemplate the fact that as we're looking at all the strange goings on in Antarctica, the three famous visitors, Aldrin, Carey, and Kirill, that this is also taking place during a season in which all over the world, really, we're witnessing a backlash against, what Catherine Austin Fitts calls Mr. Global, the whole global-loaning agenda, that we're going to have one unipolar new world order that's ruled by international corporations and bankers, so on and so forth. We've seen the Brexit vote in Europe. We're watching, we just saw the collapse of the Italian constitutional referendum and Prime Minister Renzi saying that he wants to resign. We're looking at massive unrest against the immigrant crisis in Europe and the governments that have been sponsoring them. We're watching Angela Merkel twist in the wind and trying to extricate herself from her own policies. We've elected President-elect Trump, which, again, kind of came like a bolt out of the... Mr. Trump, as far as I'm concerned, I think, first of all, his candidacy, and I've maintained this for a couple of years now. I've talked about it at some length with Catherine Fitts on her show and a few other venues as well. And I think what Trump represents is, if I can put it bluntly, a kind of a pissed-off segment of the American deep state that has watched the neocons make such a hash out of global geopolitics, out of the American economy, and so on and so forth. And that certainly looks to be true from the appointments he's been making. It looks to me like he's setting up a machine, getting certain people on board, including people like Goldman Sachs and all of that, to bring all of that money that went offshore in the past decade and a half. There's tremendous liquidity out there that has not been tapped, that I think he's planning to try and reshore and build up the country again, which from a certain standpoint even Mr. Global would I think go along with, because they need a secure power base, and that remains in North America. They need to reshore a lot of things. So it's looking to me like he represents a part of this pissed off segment of the American deep state. But when he said that he wanted to reopen the 9/11 investigation, that was really kind of what cinched it for me, because of course if he does so, it will expose the role of what the 9/11 truthers have been maintaining for quite some time, and that is that there was a rogue network in this country that either let it happen or made it happen, actually planned it, for the precise purpose of injecting American power into the Middle East and so on. That investigation would expose, as most people know, would expose the Bush family, which is the other half of the Clinton nexus, if you want to be very blunt about it. And the other thing that he did that struck me very, very odd was during the primaries, and it struck me so oddly, I had the impression that he was getting intelligence. He was getting his cues, not only as to what to say at certain points during the primary season, but when to say it. And by that I mean, if you recall, during one of the presidential debates, he made a statement about 9/11 and just really zinged Jeb Bush and left Jeb Bush sort of speechless that he would have said such a thing. And what Trump said in effect was, well, your family, was involved in 9/11 and that whole operation. And of course, what he did was he dropped the whole 9/11 truth movement and their research right out into the open on national television during a major presidential debate. And what happened as a result of it? Well, Jeb Bush, within a matter of days, literally drops out of the race. And he does the same thing with Senator Cruz. He zings him with that business about Cruz's father having been somehow involved or implicated on the fringes of the JFK assassination down in New Orleans. So somebody, it appears to me, in the Trump campaign was giving him some very detailed intelligence, and the timing of these little blurts of these little announcements that Trump made was so, I think, carefully timed, because those two campaigns were having severe financial difficulty when he made those comments. So it was like the final nail in the coffin to take out two of his major contenders. So this suggests to me very strongly that he represents something within the American deep state, some faction within it, that is not happy with the way things have gone. And it certainly appears to me that his selections for his cabinet and his transition team recently have only kind of solidified that impression in my mind. Now, whether or not any of that will happen, or if it's just going to be business as usual once he gets into office, remains to be seen. But my money is that he's quite serious, and he is going to go forward with some of these things. If he does reopen that 9/11 investigation, I think you're going to see some truly stunning is the only word I can say for it. You're going to see some stunning reversals of the narrative of 9/11 if this happens. This is the whole thing. Like I say, this is if it does, it only gives credence to this idea that he's representing some segment of the American deep state that's been very, very unhappy since 9/11. And certainly, for my own case, are probably well aware that there's enough evidence about 9/11 to suggest that there was some sort of rogue network within the American deep. I just published a book called Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery, 9/11, the Fascist International, and so on is the subtitle. In that book, I detail my suspicions about 9/11 were from the outset, that we were not only looking at an operation of a rogue group within the country. In other words, that there were two tiers to the operation, like most 9/11 truth movement researchers have concluded. But I take the view that there was actually a third level, that the second level itself was penetrated by yet a third level. And in evidence of this, I point out a number of very, very bizarre things about 9/11 that most people don't know. The first is that there was a statement, this was unearthed by our friend Jim Mars. There was a statement in Pravda that came out, I think, a couple of months prior to 9/11 by a Russian economist by the name of Dr. Tatiana Koryagina. And she stated in this Pravda op-ed piece that the United States was going to undergo a severe terrorist attack on its own territory, but that this was going to be perpetrated by a small circle of men with assets in excess of $300 trillion, and that the purpose of it would be to fashion the world according to their own designs. So in other words, she's hinting at a kind of an extraterritorial organization or entity that's ultimately behind the attacks. And then, while researching Mohammed Atta, I came across what just absolutely floored me and cemented my suspicions that you're dealing with some continuation of this German-American bunt. And certainly, the Texas roots are there. Mohammed Atta was recruited in Cairo, Egypt, by two Germans that have never been identified to this day. He goes to Germany, where he lives for several years, as we know from even the official narrative, where he lives for several years in Hamburg, Germany, in a middle-class neighborhood in Germany, apparently with this couple. But he is sponsored to Germany officially by an organization that's called the Karl Duisberg Gesellschaft. When I read that, I know he's one of the founders of IG Farben. So here we have a connection to IG Farben sponsoring Mohammed Atta to Germany. And then when he's in Florida at the flight school, this is something that Daniel Hopsiker, Welcome to Terrorland, that book that he published, uncovered in his research. When Mohammed Atta was in Venice, Florida at this flight school, supposedly, he had numerous visitors on many occasions, but they weren't Arabs. They weren't radical Muslims. They were people with names like Peter and Jürgen and Hans and Wolfgang that would come over to visit him from Europe with cash in hand. And this just caused me to really wonder. So I dug a little further, and I discovered that hiding in the mix of all of this is a post-war Swiss banker by the name of Francois Genoud, all right? Now, Monsieur Genoud, when you dig into him, turns out to be kind of the post-war agent of record, power of attorney, so to speak, for this post-war Nazi International. He is basically the banker in control of a lot of these Nazi accounts, post-war Nazi accounts, in Swiss banks. He's the guy that bankrolled Otto Skorzeny and that, late 60s, early 70s terrorist conference that invited Yasser Arafat and all the other people from the Middle East to Barcelona, Spain, for essentially what was an international terrorist summit. So it's Francois Genoud bankrolling that. But in addition to that, the real whopper was I discovered that Francois Genoud was also kind of a major go-between between Deutsche Bank and guess who? The Bin Laden family. So right in the middle of 9/11, in other words, we have a major, a huge financial Nazi aspect to this whole story, consisting of, strange connections with IG Farben and so on and so forth, a Nazi post-war banker in Switzerland. and the Bin Laden family, and Deutsche Bank, which of course was one of the major banks that was involved with 9/11 and puts and shorts on the stock market. So, the astounding thing here is when you read all this, no one, even in the 9/11 truth community, has noticed this story and attempted to follow up on it and what it might mean. And to me, this is just more proof of the pudding that we're dealing with an inherently fascist agenda. Certainly, we've seen that happen after 9/11 in this and other countries. So, I put that out there for people's consideration. That's certainly not the sum total of the book, but it's in the book, and I've taken things as far as I can take them at the moment, but it just astounds me that no one else in the 9/11 truth community has bothered to look at any of this. And now, of course, we have a president-elect with the last name of Trump, which conveniently is a German last name. So, make of it what you will. There are certainly aspects of the incoming administration that bother me. It's very easy for populist movements to turn fascist. But for the moment, I'm reserving judgment. It's looking to me like I said, that he's putting together a team to reshore a lot of capital to this country and bring back a manufacturing base. It's interesting to me that some of his considerations for cabinet posts that he hasn't filled yet include, the former CEO of Exxon, who incidentally has his own deep religious faith and is very familiar with Russia. So it's interesting to watch some of these appointments and what they signal. But when you look at all of this in the perspective of the cosmic war idea, I've said for many years that I intentionally made that book and view that book as kind of the keystone in the arch of all the books I've written. Because for me, much of this is really a spiritual conflict. And to put it bluntly, I think what the conflict is over and about is I view mankind itself as not only the prize in the war, but the battlefield on which it's fought, so to speak. I think that there's something huge under the surface. There's all of these undercurrents just beneath the surface that are quite strong, and we're seeing some of these currents bubble up in some of these populist revolts against the whole globalist plan, the whole New World Order scheme, if you will. If you look at the globalist agenda from this cosmic war perspective, what they have done is that they have literally destroyed the manufacturing base all over the world in one form or fashion. We could mention Pennsylvania, Ohio, where I live in the Midwest. You can feel the loss of interest. Going to Oxford, I traveled around the country a little bit, and I noticed, going through Sheffield or Leeds or Manchester, places like that, that were the industrial center, the might of the British Empire, and you just saw factory after factory that was literally shut down, rusting away. They've basically destroyed all of these things in the name of their globalist agenda, and they've in the process they've destroyed the middle class, the very class of people upon whom they are reliant for their own profit, bottom line. So something has to change, It's like trying to reverse course on the Titanic, You're barreling across the Atlantic at 24 knots, and you've got to change course. So something is going to have to be done. But if you view it from the spiritual point of view, the battleground is mankind. And the problem now is that technology, as you've pointed out, technology has made so many jobs redundant. And what this means, I think, is we are looking at to put it bluntly, we're looking at a major change in the whole financial economic paradigm that humanity has been operating under. It's something unique, and I've stressed this many times. This is so unique and so different that we have no precedent for what is happening in all prior human history. We've been operating for the last 3,000 to 4,000 years under a financial paradigm, monetized debt, essentially, that has run its course and can go no further. In fact, the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, at the last G7 meeting, I think it was, came right out and said, that we have pressed the debt finance model as far as we can go, and there is no reform now, or there's no fix now that is not a major reform. That's what he said. So in other words, we are looking at a huge paradigm shift, and no one really knows quite what to do. Now, if you look at what Trump's team is putting, the way it looks to me, the team he's putting together is he's trying to move back to an equity-based system. In other words, his focus is on production because he knows that the debt model cannot be pushed any further. How you manage that transition is going to be key. And, there's all this talk out there in certain segments of society that supported him that he's selling them out. Well, I don't think he is. I think what he's doing is he knows that he has to have some of those people on board with him in order to get this ship turned around. You just can't do it and go into Washington or Wall Street with a broom and make a clean sweep of everything and expect anything else other than disaster to happen. So I think he's signaling his intentions here, but whether or not he's successful, whether he gets all these people singing off the same page remains to be seen. It's quite a huge job that to get all these people going along with what he wants to do. But we have to, I think, become thoroughly familiar with how finance has been orchestrated for the past few millennia. And I say millennia, not just the past few decades or centuries, but millennia, because we're looking at a debt system of money that is no longer functional. And we have to get back to some idea of real money. For me, real money is not monetized debt. It's money. It's based on production. It's based on, so to speak, the surplus in the state warehouses, if you go all the way back to Babylon. So something different has to come into play here. And this, I think, explains why you're seeing such a panicked reaction to Trump, not necessarily even from the political left, but more importantly from the centers of finance capitalism that you see going on. I think this is what's at roots, because they realize that their old playbook is simply no longer working, but they don't have any solutions themselves, and along comes Trump. So the dangers with that scenario are obvious to all, because it can easily degenerate into a regime with a demagogue in charge of it. So we've got to be extraordinarily careful. We have to hold his feet to the fire. We have to drive the conversation publicly. We have to be engaged and involved, because we all got ourselves into this mess, and it's not going to be up to just a few people that are going to fix it. It's extremely dangerous, and the good thing is we have now with the internet and other media, we have the capacity for a real participatory democracy. I mean, my word, we've seen in this last election, which I really view as more of a referendum than an election, we've seen the corporate-controlled media expose themselves for what they are, basically shills for a particular agenda and a point of view. And the real media strength now has shifted precisely to free and independent media. And the other thing is we're willing to consider out-of-the-box thinking that the corporate-controlled media don't. And a key here is precisely, once again, finances. We have been looking at so much missing money, now in the trillions of dollars over the past few years since 9/11, that, and we've been looking at quantitative easing solutions. We've had traditional financial analysts saying, well, the sky is falling, hyperinflation's right around the corner, and of course this doesn't happen. And, that the standard models of financial analysis are not able anymore to make accurate predictions because they're ignoring part of the circuit. They're ignoring this whole hidden system of finance. They're ignoring the black projects world, all of these things that have been an enormous drain, not only on the federal budget in this country, but worldwide. So we're dealing with essentially a two-tiered financial system as well, and if you're ignoring 50% of the equation, you're committing a material omission, to use the legal term, by ignoring that whole existence of that whole entity, and therefore you can't make sense out of the contemporary world or out of contemporary finances. This is something that the Trump administration is going to have to do. It is going to have to look at these things, and from the appearances so far that I can tell of the people he's putting into place, he's creating the machine to do precisely that. If he, going back to your 9/11 investigation question, if he indeed opens up the whole 9/11 investigation, one of the most glaring things that has yet to be explained adequately are all the financial dealings that occurred prior to and on and immediately after 9/11. Yeah, which hints very strongly, to my mind, of the existence of this hidden system of finance. And this has never been adequately explained. What was the basis of this inside knowledge? Because clearly this is what was going on. I point out in the book, the 9/11 book, Hidden Finance and Rogue Networks, Secret Sorcery, I point out that on 9/11 and after 9/11, there were, I believe, something to the effect of $200+ billion worth of fraudulent securities that were set to clear that week. And of course, 9/11 happens. And as a result of this, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, suspends normal clearing regulations for about a week. So what happens as a result of that? Well, under normal regulations, you cannot substitute one set of securities for another set of securities that's set to clear. But when the regulations are suspended, you can do that. You can substitute securities for others set to clear. So they suspend regulations, and all of those fraudulent securities that were in the system suddenly magically disappear, of course. And everything else is cleared. So there's huge financial aspects to 9/11 that again have not been addressed, and that hint very strongly, once again, of some sort of hidden system of finance being run by some sort of rogue network. And this is where I think Trump could run into trouble, because of course he's bringing in a lot of people with Wall Street connections and so on. And incidentally, the very same people that were instrumental in offshoring all of this capital that sloshed around in the system, particularly after the bailout hearings. Well, all of this capital goes offshore, and it sits there, and the financial analysts are befuddled as to why there's no hyperinflation resulting from all this massive capital injection. So I think, again, it's looking to me like he's contacting the very people that were responsible for all this, bringing them into his administration, because they're the ones that know where this capital is. And they're the ones with experience that would be able to bring it back and reshore it to this country. So, the 9/11 investigation here may fall by the wayside for that reason. I don't know. Time will tell. We're looking at such an extraordinary upheaval around the world, and with this last election, that I think we have to look very carefully. I was sitting on the edge of my seat throughout this last election season, but as I've warned people, we just got done with the overture. Now the curtain's going to go up on the opera. So if you think all of this is over, you've got another thing coming. This is just beginning.